The name on the application form stopped Suzanne Beauregard cold. She had been moving through the stack quickly, the way she always did on Thursday afternoons when the hiring committee left the preliminary screening to her. Most of it was routine. Maintenance positions at Lakeview Regional Medical Center drew a steady trickle of applicants. Retirees looking for something to fill the hours, students between semesters, people who needed benefits and weren't particular about the work. She read each form with the same efficient attention she brought to everything, made her notes in the margin, set it face down to the left. Then she turned over the next sheet and read the name at the top. Theodore Marsh. She did not put it down. She read it again. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the parking lot, at the row of bare maples along the far edge, and did not move for a long moment. She told herself it was probably a coincidence. It was a common enough name. There would be more than one Theodore Marsh in the province, certainly more than one in Ontario. She picked the form back up and read the rest of it. The address was a small street in the east end of the city, not far from the rail yards. No university listed, no professional credentials. Previous employment, a hardware store in Sudbury, a property maintenance company, 8 months at a food distribution warehouse. The phone number had a 705 area code. Under the section asking for additional information, the applicant had written one sentence in very small, precise handwriting. "I am a reliable worker, and I will not cause problems." Suzanne set the form down. She looked at it for another moment. Then she picked up her phone and called downstairs to the facilities coordinator and told him she wanted to conduct this particular interview herself. Theodore Marsh arrived 12 minutes early. Suzanne knew because she happened to be passing the reception desk when he came through the main entrance, and she recognized him immediately, despite the 17 years that had passed. He was wearing dark work pants and a gray flannel shirt, collar buttoned. His hair had gone mostly silver. He was heavier through the shoulders than she remembered, and he moved with a slight favoring of his left side. The kind of thing you notice without being able to name it. He gave his name to the woman at the desk in a quiet, even voice and sat down in one of the waiting chairs near the window and folded his hands in his lap. He did not look around the lobby. He did not check his phone. He sat the way people sit when they have learned to be comfortable with waiting, or when they no longer expect waiting to end quickly. Suzanne went back to her office by the long route so he wouldn't see her. She had been prepared to feel nothing in particular. She was 51 years old, and she had been running the administrative operations of this hospital for 6 years, and before that she had spent 9 years in regional health authority management, and before that she had done her MBA at Dalhousie and her undergraduate at Western. She had learned a long time ago to separate what she felt from what she needed to do. It was not a skill she was especially proud of, but it was a skill she had, and it had served her well. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the credenza. She straightened the folder on her desk. She pressed the intercom and told reception to send him up in 5 minutes. She used those 5 minutes to think carefully about what she actually remembered and what she had only decided to remember. The meetings at Western had been in the mathematics department, which occupied the 3rd floor of Middlesex College. Suzanne had been doing her undergrad in economics, and she had taken second-year calculus to satisfy a breadth requirement, and Theodore Marsh had been in her section. He was not particularly easy to know. He sat near the back and rarely spoke in class, but when the professor asked a question that stumped the rest of them, he would answer it with the same quiet flatness he brought to everything, without preamble, without checking whether the class was following. Several times that semester, the professor stopped mid-lecture to look at whatever Theodore had written in his margin notes and asked if he wanted to walk through it at the board. He always said no thank you. Suzanne had spoken to him directly perhaps 4 times the whole semester. Once he had explained a proof to her in the library before a midterm, sitting very straight in his chair, writing out each step in the same precise small handwriting she had recognized this morning on the application form. When she understood it finally, she said thank you, and he said you're welcome, and that was the end of it. He was not unfriendly. He was simply not in the habit of extending himself socially, and he did not seem to notice that other people found this strange. She had heard later, through someone who knew someone in the math department, that Theodore Marsh had been offered a doctoral fellowship at Waterloo, and had turned it down. No one seemed to know why. By then she was in her final year and had her own things to think about, and she did not think about him again for a very long time. Until today. He came to the door of her office and knocked on the frame, even though the door was open. That detail registered in some part of her brain before she knew why it mattered. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "please come in." He sat in the chair across from her desk and she looked at him properly for the first time. He was 53 or 54, she calculated. The lines in his face were the kind that came from weather and not from worry. His hands, resting on his knees, were marked with the small cuts and calluses of physical work. "I want to be straightforward with you," Suzanne said. "I reviewed your application and I noticed that we attended Western at the same time. I don't know if you remember me." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "You were in Calculus 221. You had questions that the professor found inconvenient." She had not expected that. She let a small pause go by. "The HR department flagged your application," she said. "You're overqualified for the position you're applying for." That's their language, not mine. "But it did prompt me to want to speak with you directly." She paused. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me about why you're applying for a custodial position here?" Theodore Marsh looked at the window. Not out of it, at it, as though the glass itself was something worth examining. "I need steady work," he said. "I can do this work. I won't cause problems. That's what you wrote on the form. It's still true." Suzanne waited. He did not add anything. "Can I ask what you've been doing for the past several years?" He turned back from the window. "Working," he said. "Different things. I was up north for a while. Sudbury, then Timmins." Another pause. "My wife passed away 4 years ago. We have a daughter. She's 11. He said it the way people say facts they have made their peace with. Not flatly exactly, not without feeling, but without the expectation that the feeling would be acknowledged or needed to be. Suzanne looked down at the folder. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you." He said it like he meant it, which she noticed. She hired him that afternoon. She told herself the reasons were practical. He was qualified, he was local, the position needed to be filled before the end of the month. All of that was true. She also knew it was not the whole truth, and she was careful enough with herself to know the difference, even if she wasn't going to examine it too closely right now. Theodore started the following Monday, assigned to the East Wing, which covered the long-term care unit on 3 and the administrative corridor on 4. The facilities coordinator, a compact and efficient man named Gary, who had worked at Lakeview for 19 years, gave Theodore his orientation the same way he gave everyone's orientation, briskly, without condescension, with particular attention to the biohazard protocols and the correct procedure for corridor disruption during emergency response. Theodore listened without asking questions. When Gary finished, Theodore asked one question: whether the east stairwell map on the wall matched the current configuration or the pre-2019 renovation layout. Gary had stopped walking. "Why?" he said. "The exit signage on the stairwell door doesn't match what's on the map," Theodore said. "If someone were navigating during a fire or a power failure, that's a problem." Gary went and looked at the map and looked at the door and came back. "That's been there for 6 years, he said. "Nobody flagged it." "I'm flagging it now," Theodore said without any particular emphasis, and Gary had the odd experience of not knowing whether he had just been criticized or simply informed. He wrote it up and sent it to facilities management that afternoon. He did not mention where it had come from. The East Wing had a rhythm to it that Theodore learned in the first week. The long-term care floor was quiet in the early mornings, except for the night nurses finishing their handoff and the smell of breakfast coming from the service elevator. The administrative corridor was busier by 8, and by 9 it had the dense, purposeful movement of people who had too much to do and not enough time to do it. He worked without drawing attention. He moved the way people move when they are good at something, economically, without waste, without the performance of effort. The staff on 3 learned his schedule quickly and worked around it, which was the highest compliment available in a care environment, and they gave it to him without thinking about it. One morning in his 3rd week, one of the nurses on 3, a woman named Adrian, who had been at Lakeview for 12 years and had a voice that could carry across a ward without being raised, stopped him in the corridor. "The floor in 318 is coming up at the corner," she said. "Near the window, Mrs. Kolanowski keeps catching her walker on it." "I saw it this morning," Theodore said. I've submitted a repair order. It should be addressed by Thursday. Adrienne looked at him. I put in a request for that floor 3 months ago. I know, he said. I found the original ticket in the backlog. I resubmitted it and added a patient safety notation. That's why it moved up. Adrienne was quiet for a moment. How did you get into the backlog system? I asked Gary for access. Theodore said. The maintenance queue on this floor had 43 outstanding items. Some of them were from 2021. He said it without accusation, without drama. He was already moving the cart forward. Adrienne watched him go and then stood in the hallway for a moment before continuing on her rounds. She mentioned it to Suzanne the following week, not quite sure why, only that it seemed like the kind of thing the administrator should know. Suzanne was careful about how much attention she paid to Theodore Marsh's movements. She was aware that she was paying attention, and she was aware that this was not something she did with other members of the custodial staff, and she held this awareness as a mild embarrassment that she kept separate from her professional decisions. But word found its way to her anyway, the way word does in a hospital, where information moves through the building like air through ductwork, everywhere and from no particular source. The medical records coordinator mentioned that the filing room on 4 had been reorganized. Not the files themselves, which were locked, but the storage carts and the labeling system, which had accumulated 17 years of inconsistency and had been straightened into a logical sequence with a typed index attached to the wall above the cart stand. Nobody had asked for this. Nobody had ordered it. When the coordinator asked Theodore about it, he said he had noticed that people spent a lot of time looking for things on that cart, and he thought it could be done differently. The head of biomedical equipment services came to Suzanne directly. He was a careful man who did not tend toward exaggeration, and he prefaced what he said by acknowledging that he might be wrong. I don't know who flagged the sterilization unit on 4, he said, but whoever it was identified an error in the calibration log that we missed in last month's audit. It wasn't a safety failure yet, but it would have been. He paused. The note was left on my desk. It was handwritten. There was no name on it, but it included a reference to the relevant section of the CSA standard and a calculation showing the drift rate over the past 6 cycles. Suzanne looked at him. I assume you know who left it, he said. She said she would look into it. She did not look into it immediately. She sat with it for 2 days, and in that time she found herself reconstructing things she thought she had long since stopped thinking about. The proof in the library before the midterm, the professor pausing mid-lecture, the fellowship at Waterloo that Theodore had turned down without explanation. She had never asked why. She had been 20 years old and in the process of becoming herself, and she had not thought to ask. She wondered now if anyone had. She found him on the 4th floor just after 7 in the morning, before most of the administrative staff arrived. He was moving steadily along the corridor, unhurried, and he stopped when he saw her coming. Good morning, he said. Good morning. She fell into step beside him, which she could see slightly surprised him, though he adjusted without comment. I'd like to talk with you for a few minutes, if that's all right. Of course. They walked to the end of the corridor where there was a window overlooking the courtyard. The maples down there still had a few leaves, yellow now and loosening. Theodore stopped the cart and waited. The calibration note, Suzanne said. The biomedical coordinator showed it to me. Theodore looked out the window. The CSA section reference was from the current standard, she said. The one that was updated 18 months ago. Most of our clinical staff don't carry that in their head. It's available online, he said. Theodore, he turned from the window. I'm not trying to catch you at anything, she said. I'm trying to understand what happened to you. Something moved through his expression that she might have missed if she hadn't been watching carefully. It was not pain exactly. It was the look of someone who had been asked a question they had answered internally so many times that the external version felt almost redundant. My wife got sick, he said, the year after our daughter was born. It was a long illness. We went through the savings. I took whatever work I could find near where she was being treated. He paused. After she passed, I took my daughter to stay with her grandmother in Sudbury for a while. I needed to stabilize things. By the time I was ready to do something else, I had been out of anything professional for long enough that it didn't seem worth trying to re-enter. Worth trying, Suzanne said. Worth the disruption to my daughter, he said. She'd had enough disruption. Suzanne was quiet for a moment. So you decided to disappear. He considered this. I decided to be present, he said. For the work I was doing for her, that seemed like enough. Below in the courtyard, a maintenance vehicle was moving along the path between the gardens. They watched it for a moment without speaking. The board has been looking at a new position, Suzanne said. We're building out a patient safety and systems function. It's not been publicly posted yet. It would involve reviewing processes, identifying gaps, developing protocols. She paused. I think you understand what I'm describing. That's not a custodial position, Theodore said. No, it's not. He was quiet. In the corridor behind them, the elevator opened and a group of nurses came through, talking among themselves, and passed without looking at them. I don't have credentials for that kind of role, he said. Not on paper. You have references. From hardware stores and warehouses. I'm not asking about that kind of reference, Suzanne said. She met his eyes. I'm asking whether there are people who can speak to your ability to do analytical work. Colleagues, former supervisors, anyone. There may be some people at Waterloo, he said after a moment. I kept in contact with one of the faculty there, loosely. For years. He said it like he was confessing to something minor. Would you be willing to have a conversation about this, a formal one, with me and 2 members of the board? He looked at her steadily. Why are you doing this? It was a fair question, and she had thought about how she would answer it. Because the calibration error you flagged could have harmed someone, she said, and because you flagged it correctly using a standard our own staff missed, and then you put no name on it, and that tells me something about your judgment. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might say no. All right, he said. A conversation. The meeting with the board was 3 weeks later, in the second-floor conference room with the long windows that looked north toward the lake. There were 4 of them at the table. Suzanne, the board chair, a woman named Philippa Arsenault, who had spent 30 years in healthcare policy, and the director of clinical operations, a man named David who asked careful questions and wrote everything down. Theodore came in with a manila folder and set it on the table. In the folder were 3 things. A 12-page document identifying systemic process failures he had observed in his 8 weeks at Lakeview, cross-reference to the relevant accreditation standards. A 2-page letter from a professor of applied mathematics at the University of Waterloo, dated the previous week, which described Theodore's work on a research problem in probabilistic modeling that the faculty member said had not been formally published, only because Theodore had declined to put his name on it, and a single-page summary of what a patient safety function at Lakeview could accomplish in the first year, written in plain language without jargon, with a proposed framework for prioritization. Philippa read the 12-page document while David and Suzanne talked with Theodore. She did not look up for 20 minutes. When she did, she looked at Theodore with the specific attention of someone who has revised their understanding of a situation. You observed all of this in 8 weeks, she said. Some of it was in the first 2 weeks, Theodore said. The calibration issue was the 3rd day. Why didn't you come forward sooner? I wasn't sure I'd be listened to. Philippa set the document down. That's a fair concern, she said. And she said it like she meant it. David asked about the Waterloo letter. Theodore explained it without self-promotion, in the same direct, unhurried way. He explained everything. There had been a modeling problem involving patient flow in emergency settings. He had been corresponding with the faculty member on an unrelated matter. He had mentioned a possible approach. It had led to a more extended collaboration over email. The paper had been submitted under the faculty member's name. Because Theodore had felt at the time that he had no institutional affiliation that would lend the work credibility. You gave away the authorship of a published paper, David said. It seemed practical at the time, Theodore said. There was a silence at the table. I have a question, Philippa said, and I want you to answer it directly. She looked at him. If we offer you this position and you take it, what do you need from us to do it well? Theodore thought for a moment. It was the first time in the meeting that he seemed to be genuinely gathering himself, searching for the right answer, rather than simply retrieving it. Access, he said finally, to the real information, not the version that's been prepared for review. I need to be able to read the actual incident logs, the actual maintenance backlogs, the actual patient complaint records. He paused. I don't need a large office. I don't need an assistant. I need people to tell me the truth about what's actually happening in this building." Philippa looked at Suzanne. Suzanne looked at the table for a moment and then back at Theodore. "We can do that," she said. He started in the new role the first Monday of November, in a small office on the second floor across from the medical records room. The office had a window that looked onto the courtyard, and a desk that was too large for the space, and a whiteboard that someone had left equations on in marker that had partially dried out. The lines faded and pale. He did not erase them right away. He looked at them for a while before he sat down. The work suited him the way certain work suits certain people, not because it was easy, but because it fit the shape of how his mind moved. He was methodical without being slow. He followed a problem until it stopped, then went back to the place where it had branched and tried the other direction. He did not announce his findings at staff meetings or copy himself on escalating email chains. He wrote reports that were clear and specific and short, with the supporting evidence attached, and he sent them to the people responsible for the relevant area and followed up in person if there was no response in 2 weeks. He was not easy to know. The staff on 2, who were accustomed to a professional culture that moved through performance and visibility, found him initially unsettling. He did not present himself in the ways they expected. He did not talk about his previous work except when directly asked. He ate lunch in his office most days, sometimes working, sometimes reading. He asked questions that were precise and did not carry the softening language people used when they did not want to seem critical. But he was reliably correct. And in a hospital, where the consequences of being wrong were not abstract, this mattered in ways that other qualities did not. By February, the clinical operations team had begun sending him problems they couldn't untangle, not officially, not through any established channel, but in the informal way that hospitals develop informal channels, a message through the internal system, a knock on the open door, a folder left on the desk with a post-it that said only, "What do you think?" He answered them all. He did not keep score. Adrian from the long-term care floor found him one afternoon in the east stairwell, which had been his first flagged issue at Lakeview and which had since been correctly remapped and re-signposted. He was standing at the second-floor landing looking up at the new sign with something in his expression she couldn't quite name. "You know they fixed that because of you," she said. He glanced at her. "They fixed it because it needed to be fixed." "That's not really how things work here," she said. "Or anywhere." He looked back at the sign. "I know," he said. "I've noticed." She started up the stairs and then stopped. "Your daughter," she said. "How old did you say?" 11, he said. "Almost 12. Does she know what you do?" He thought about it for a moment. "She knows I help fix problems at the hospital," he said. "She asked if I was a doctor. I told her no. She said that was fine. She already had a doctor." Adrienne laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it. Theodore looked at the sign for another moment, then put his hand in his pocket and turned back toward the corridor. "She's coming to visit on Saturday," he said. "I told her I'd show her the courtyard. They have a garden out there. She likes that kind of thing." Adrienne watched him go. He walked the way he always walked, without hurry, without announcement, as though arriving somewhere had never been the point. The Saturday was cold and bright, the way November Saturdays sometimes are in Ontario, with a hard sky and the light coming at an angle that made everything look more precise than usual. Theodore's daughter, whose name was Rosemary, was not quite what the staff who happened to see her had expected. She was small for 11, with her father's same quality of attention. She looked at things carefully before she spoke about them, and she asked questions that did not go where you thought they were going. She stood at the edge of the courtyard garden, which was brown and put to bed for winter but still had the shapes of the beds visible, the low frames and the careful intervals, and she studied it for a long time before she said anything. "Do patients come out here?" she asked. "The ones who are well enough," Theodore said. "Is it enough garden?" She seemed to be asking this seriously, not rhetorically. "Probably not," Theodore said. "I've been thinking about that." Rosemary looked at him. Then she looked back at the garden. "You could put in more beds along that wall," she said. "The light looks like it would be okay there." "It's south-facing," Theodore said. "You're right." They stood there for a moment, both looking at the same wall, thinking about the same problem from the same direction. Suzanne had come down to the lobby for something unrelated, and happened to see them through the glass doors to the courtyard. The man and the girl, standing side by side in the cold light, not talking now, looking at the garden wall with the same quiet, purposeful attention. She stopped without thinking about it. She watched for a moment. Then she went back to what she had been doing. She thought about it later, though, the way they stood, the way the girl had the same stillness her father had. Not the stillness of someone holding themselves back, but the stillness of someone who had found, for the moment, exactly where they needed to be. In December, Theodore submitted a proposal to expand the courtyard garden by adding 3 raised beds along the south wall, with priority planting for species documented to have measurable effects on patient stress indicators. He included a cost estimate, 2 peer-reviewed studies from the Canadian Journal of Health Psychology, and a maintenance plan requiring no additional staffing, because he had already spoken with 2 members of the long-term care unit who had indicated interest in maintaining a bed each. Philippa brought it to the board in January. It was approved unanimously. When the beds were built the following spring, nobody put a plaque on them or held an announcement. The patients who could come outside came outside when the weather allowed. The garden grew the way gardens grow when someone has thought carefully about what belongs there. Theodore went out to look at it one morning before his shift. He stood at the edge of the south beds and checked the new growth against what he had written in the proposal. Then he put his hands in his pockets and went upstairs to start work.